If my wife is hiding something tonight, I almost hope it's an affair, Jonathan Hayes whispered to himself as he eased his black SUV into the shadows across the street. Because I don't think I can survive the truth my instincts are trying to tell me. Until that evening, Jonathan believed he had everything most people spent a lifetime chasing. A successful investment firm, a home overlooking the water, more money than he could reasonably spend. And Emily, his wife of 4 years, 7 months pregnant with the daughter they had dreamed about together since the day they married. Friends called them perfect. Business magazines praised Jonathan as a self-made millionaire who never forgot where he came from. Their neighbors admired Emily's kindness, her quiet smile, the homemade cookies she delivered every Christmas, and the way she still waved to every crossing guard and mail carrier by name. From the outside, their life looked untouchable. But perfect lives don't usually begin unraveling with a single unanswered phone call. It started 3 weeks earlier when Jonathan noticed Emily stepping outside every evening just before 9. She always returned an hour later. She never seemed nervous, never offered strange excuses, and never acted like someone carrying a secret. She simply kissed him on the forehead, smiled gently, and said she needed a little fresh air before bed. At first, he believed her. Pregnancy changed routines. Doctors encouraged light walks. Fresh air helped with sleep. It all sounded reasonable. Then came the receipts. Small cash withdrawals. Not large enough to trigger concern. Just enough to leave questions. $50 here. $100 there. Emily had never liked carrying cash. She paid for everything with her phone. Jonathan noticed because numbers had always been his language. Tiny patterns had built his fortune. Tiny patterns also had a habit of exposing uncomfortable truths. He tried asking casually where she'd been. She answered with the same warm smile that had made him fall in love years ago. Just clearing my head. No hesitation. No defensive tone. Nothing that sounded dishonest. Somehow, that made it worse. Honest people usually stumble when they're forced to hide something important. Emily never stumbled. Tonight, when she quietly picked up her purse and slipped out the front door wearing a light gray sweater over her maternity dress, Jonathan waited exactly 30 seconds before following. He kept 2 cars behind her through quiet suburban streets until the familiar neighborhoods disappeared. Streetlights grew farther apart. Expensive homes gave way to aging brick buildings that seemed forgotten by time. Emily finally turned onto a narrow side street Jonathan had never visited before. She parked beside a weathered apartment complex where several porch lights had burned out long ago. There were no luxury vehicles, no upscale restaurants, no doctor's office, no obvious reason for Emily Hayes to be there. Jonathan watched as she stepped out carefully, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly. She looked around, not with fear, but with quiet determination. Then she reached into her purse, removed a thick, white envelope, and disappeared inside the oldest building on the block. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jonathan's pulse refused to settle. Every explanation he'd rehearsed dissolved into silence. Finally, the front door opened again. An elderly woman with silver hair appeared in the dim hallway. Emily embraced her so tightly that both women began to cry. Jonathan couldn't hear a single word from where he sat, but he didn't need to. The woman's trembling lips formed one sentence so clearly that it stole every confident thought from his mind. "Welcome home, my daughter." Jonathan remained inside the parked SUV long after the front door closed behind Emily. His fingers rested motionless on the steering wheel while a single question echoed louder than the quiet street around him. Daughter? The word made no sense. Emily had told him countless times that both of her parents had passed away years before they met. There had been no funeral stories, no old family friends, no holiday visits, only a small collection of faded photographs she kept inside a wooden box at the back of their closet. Jonathan had never questioned it because grief looked different on everyone. Now every memory returned carrying a different meaning. He watched the second-floor window where a warm yellow light suddenly appeared behind thin curtains. 2 silhouettes moved slowly across the room. One belonged to Emily. The other belonged to the elderly woman. They sat facing each other for several minutes before Emily reached into her purse again and carefully placed the thick envelope onto the small kitchen table. The older woman immediately shook her head and tried to hand it back. Emily gently closed the woman's fingers around it, smiling through tears. Whatever they were saying, it was not an argument. It looked like love, genuine love. Jonathan felt something unexpected settle over him. Relief should have come first. Instead, confusion grew heavier with every passing second. If this was not an affair, then why had Emily hidden it? Why lie every single evening? Why invent walks around the neighborhood when she was driving nearly 40 minutes across town? He considered walking inside and demanding answers. He even reached for the door handle before stopping himself. Emily had never invaded his privacy. She had trusted him completely. Following her here already felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. So he waited. 20 minutes later, the apartment door opened again. Emily stepped outside carrying nothing except her purse. The white envelope remained inside. She hugged the elderly woman one last time, whispering something that made both of them smile despite their tears. Then Emily slowly walked back toward her car. Jonathan ducked lower in his seat until she drove away. He counted another full minute before stepping out and crossing the quiet sidewalk. The building smelled faintly of old wood, fresh coffee, and laundry soap. Apartment 2B still glowed softly beneath the hallway light. Jonathan raised his hand to knock, then stopped. What would he even say? Hello, I secretly followed my pregnant wife, and now I would like an explanation? His phone buzzed suddenly, startling him. Emily's name filled the screen. His heartbeat quickened as he answered. Her voice sounded calm, almost cheerful. She asked if he wanted anything from the grocery store because she had decided to stop on the way home. Jonathan closed his eyes. She was giving him another ordinary explanation while standing miles away from the supermarket she claimed to be visiting. He quietly answered that he did not need anything. She wished him good night in the same gentle tone she always used before hanging up. Jonathan stared at the dark phone screen for several seconds before slipping it back into his pocket. As he turned to leave, the apartment door opened behind him. The elderly woman stepped into the hallway holding a folded baby blanket stitched by hand with tiny blue and yellow stars. She looked directly at Jonathan, as though she had been expecting him all along. Instead of asking who he was or why he had come, she offered a sad, knowing smile and softly said, "You finally came." Emily always believed this night would happen sooner or later. Jonathan slowly turned to face the elderly woman, searching her expression for anger, suspicion, or even fear. He found none. Instead, there was only a quiet exhaustion that seemed to belong to someone who had carried an impossible burden for far too long. She held the tiny baby blanket close against her chest and opened the apartment door a little wider. "You should come inside," she said softly. "There are some truths that deserve to be heard while people are still willing to listen." Jonathan hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the modest apartment. It looked nothing like the elegant spaces he and Emily called home. The furniture was old but carefully maintained. Framed photographs covered nearly every wall. Family birthdays, school graduations, holiday dinners, ordinary moments frozen in time. Yet one detail immediately caught his attention. Emily appeared in dozens of the pictures, not as an adult, as a little girl, 7 years old with missing front teeth, 10 years old holding a science fair ribbon, 15 years old laughing beside a birthday cake. Jonathan felt the room tilt beneath him. Every photograph represented years of a childhood Emily had insisted no longer existed. "My name is Margaret Lawson," the woman finally said. "Emily has called me Miss Margaret since she was 8 years old." Jonathan frowned. "You are not her mother?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "No, but sometimes life allows people to become family without sharing the same blood." Jonathan looked back toward the photographs, unable to take his eyes away from them. Then why did she tell me she had no family left? Margaret lowered herself into an old rocking chair beside the window before answering. Because that was the easiest story to tell. The real one was too painful. Silence settled between them. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows. Jonathan listened as Margaret folded the baby blanket across her lap with remarkable care. "Emily's parents did pass away," she said quietly. "She was only 8 years old when she lost them both within a single year. After that, she entered the foster care system. She moved through 5 different homes before she was 13. Jonathan felt every word land heavier than the last. Emily had never mentioned foster care, never mentioned moving from family to family, never once hinted at the loneliness hidden beneath her gentle smile. Margaret continued, "I worked as a school librarian back then. Emily spent every afternoon reading because books were the only places where children always found happy endings. She would stay until closing time just so she did not have to return to another unfamiliar house. Jonathan remembered how Emily still collected novels, how every room in their home contained shelves overflowing with books. He had always teased her about buying more than she could ever finish. Suddenly those shelves no longer looked like a hobby. They looked like a refuge she had never truly left behind. When I retired, Margaret said, we stayed close. She visited every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, even after college, even after she met you. Jonathan swallowed hard. Then why keep all of this from me? Margaret smiled sadly. Because Emily believed love should never begin with sympathy. She wanted someone to choose her for the woman she became, not because they felt sorry for the child she once was. Jonathan lowered his eyes. He remembered every conversation where Emily quietly redirected questions about her past. Every family gathering where she smiled politely while saying she preferred small holidays. Every time she insisted that what mattered was the future, never the past. He had accepted those answers because they sounded peaceful. Now he realized they had been carefully built walls. Margaret reached beneath the coffee table and lifted a weathered cardboard box tied with a faded blue ribbon. She placed it gently in front of Jonathan. Emily asked me to keep this until the day you discovered the truth on your own, she whispered. If you are sitting here tonight, then I believe she always knew this day would eventually come. Jonathan stared at the faded blue ribbon for several long seconds before carefully loosening the knot. The cardboard box looked ordinary, the kind that might hold old holiday decorations or forgotten photographs. But the moment he lifted the lid, he realized it contained something far more valuable than money. Every item inside represented a chapter of Emily's life that she had quietly carried alone. On top rested a stack of handmade birthday cards. The earliest one had crooked letters and glitter scattered across construction paper. Happy 9th birthday, Emily. Love, Miss Margaret. Beneath it were dozens more, one for every single year. Jonathan slowly turned each card over, noticing how the messages grew longer as Emily grew older. They celebrated small victories that most families would take for granted. Your first honor roll, your first summer job, your college acceptance, your first apartment. Every milestone had been witnessed by Margaret when no one else had been there. Under the cards lay a worn library card with Emily's childhood signature written in careful block letters. Jonathan smiled despite the ache growing inside his chest. He remembered teasing Emily about carrying a library card even after becoming an adult. She had laughed and said it reminded her where every good story began. He had never realized she was speaking literally. Margaret quietly watched him without interrupting. Finally, Jonathan reached the bottom of the box and discovered a thick envelope secured with a small note in Emily's handwriting. It simply read, "Only if he learns the truth by following his heart instead of his fear." Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the pages inside. The first document was not a letter. It was a series of monthly payment receipts stretching back nearly 6 years. Every payment had been made from Emily's personal savings account, not their shared finances. The amounts were modest but consistent, always arriving on the same date each month. Jonathan quickly realized these were the very cash withdrawals he had noticed only weeks earlier. He looked toward Margaret. "She has been helping you all this time?" Margaret gently nodded. "Not just me." She reached for another folder inside the box and handed it to him. Jonathan opened it slowly. Inside were receipts from local pharmacies, grocery stores, utility companies, and medical clinics. Different names appeared on every page. An elderly veteran, a widowed teacher, a single father recovering from surgery, a retired firefighter. Jonathan flipped through them faster, unable to believe what he was seeing. Emily had quietly supported complete strangers for years without ever mentioning a single one. "She asked each of us to promise never to tell anyone," Margaret explained. "Especially you." Jonathan felt a painful knot tighten in his chest. Why would she hide something this beautiful? Margaret smiled with tears gathering in her eyes. Because she believed generosity changes the moment it becomes a performance. Jonathan lowered his gaze to the final sheet inside the envelope. It listed every person Emily had been helping, along with birthdays, favorite meals, medications, and handwritten reminders to check on them during holidays. None of the notes sounded like charity. They sounded like family. Then one final page slipped from the folder and landed softly on the floor. Jonathan bent down to pick it up. It was an ultrasound appointment reminder dated 3 weeks earlier. Across the top, in neat handwriting, Emily had written one sentence to herself. "Do not cancel this time." She had crossed those words out with a single careful line. Below them, she had written another sentence that stole the air from Jonathan's lungs. "Mrs. Harper needs the appointment more than I do." Jonathan slowly looked back at Margaret, struggling to understand. Before he could speak, Margaret quietly whispered, "Jonathan, there is one part of Emily's secret that even you have not discovered yet, and once you do, you will finally understand why she could never tell you herself." Jonathan remained silent, unable to find words that matched the weight pressing against his chest. Every assumption he had made over the past 3 weeks had quietly collapsed inside Margaret's living room. He had followed his wife expecting to uncover deception. Instead, he had uncovered a version of Emily that somehow made him love her even more, while also making him realize how little he truly knew about the woman sleeping beside him every night. Margaret reached toward the bookshelf and carefully removed a weathered photo album. Unlike the cheerful pictures hanging on the walls, this one looked older, its corners softened by years of use. She opened it to the first page. There was Emily at 16, standing beside a hospital bed, smiling despite the exhaustion on her young face. In the bed rested an elderly woman Jonathan had never seen before. Tubes and blankets surrounded her, but what caught his attention was the expression in Emily's eyes. It was the same gentle determination he still saw every morning across the breakfast table. "That is Eleanor Harper," Margaret said quietly. Most people simply called her Mrs. Harper. Jonathan looked up. The name sounded familiar. He remembered reading it only moments earlier on the canceled appointment reminder. Margaret continued before he could ask another question. When Emily was 16, Mrs. Harper volunteered at the community center where foster children came after school. She noticed Emily always pretending she had already eaten dinner so the younger children could have the extra meals. One evening, she quietly packed leftovers into a paper bag and told Emily she had accidentally made too much soup. Emily thanked her as though she had been handed a treasure. Jonathan listened without moving. That simple act became a tradition, Margaret continued. Every Friday, Mrs. Harper found another excuse to share a meal. She never made Emily feel like a charity case. She made her feel like family. Jonathan slowly turned another page. There were photographs of birthdays, graduation ceremonies, Thanksgiving dinners, and Christmas mornings. Emily appeared in every one, smiling beside Mrs. Harper as though they had always belonged together. She became the grandmother Emily never had, Margaret whispered. When Mrs. Harper became ill several years ago, Emily made herself a promise. She would never allow the woman who once protected her to face old age alone. Jonathan lowered his eyes toward the appointment reminder again. So Emily skipped her own prenatal appointment because Margaret finished the sentence for him. Because Mrs. Harper's specialist only had one opening that week, and Emily believed her own appointment could wait. Jonathan closed his eyes. The realization settled heavily over him. Emily had never considered her kindness extraordinary. She had simply rearranged her own life whenever someone else needed help more urgently. Margaret carefully reached beneath the album and removed one final envelope, sealed with pale blue wax. "I have struggled with whether I should show you this tonight," she admitted. "Emily asked me not to unless circumstances left me no other choice." Jonathan accepted the envelope and gently broke the seal. Inside rested a single folded letter addressed in Emily's handwriting. The date at the top stopped him cold. She had written it almost 5 months before. His eyes moved slowly across the first sentence. "If you are reading this, it means you finally discovered where I have been going every evening, and I am sorry you had to learn this part of my life without me standing beside you." Jonathan's heartbeat quickened as he continued reading, until one sentence near the middle forced him to stop completely. "I have been keeping one final secret because I wanted our daughter to meet her father before he had to carry this burden with me." Jonathan looked up in confusion. "What burden?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she did not answer immediately. Instead, she quietly whispered the words Jonathan was least prepared to hear. "Emily has not been visiting this neighborhood only for Mrs. Harper. She has also been coming here because someone else has been waiting to meet the man she married, and that meeting will change both of your lives forever." Jonathan lowered the letter into his lap, reading the final paragraph again as though the words might rearrange themselves into something easier to understand. They never did. Emily had written every sentence with the same quiet honesty that defined the way she lived. There were no dramatic confessions, no desperate excuses, only gentle apologies for carrying a burden she believed belonged to her alone. Jonathan looked toward Margaret, who had remained patiently silent. "Who has been waiting to meet me?" he finally asked. Margaret drew a slow breath before standing and walking toward a narrow hallway. "Come with me." Jonathan followed her past the small kitchen and into a modest spare bedroom. Unlike the rest of the apartment, this room felt unexpectedly bright. Sunlight-colored curtains framed a single window, children's books filled one shelf, and a rocking chair rested beside a neatly made twin bed. On the dresser sat dozens of framed drawings created with colored pencils. Most showed flowers, birds, smiling families, and houses with bright blue roofs. Jonathan noticed one drawing placed carefully in the center. It showed a man, a pregnant woman, and a little girl holding hands beneath the words, "My forever family." He frowned. "Who drew these?" Margaret smiled softly. "A little girl named Lily." Jonathan searched the room. "Where is she?" "Sleeping next door tonight. She spends 3 evenings here every week while her grandmother receives overnight treatments." Jonathan looked confused. "Mrs. Harper has a granddaughter?" Margaret nodded. "She does now." Jonathan stared at her, waiting for the explanation that refused to come. Margaret finally sat in the rocking chair and folded her hands. 3 years ago, Emily volunteered at the children's reading program held inside the community center. One afternoon, social workers brought in a quiet little girl who had barely spoken for months after losing both of her parents in an accident. She would not play with the other children. She would not answer questions. She only sat in the corner, holding the same stuffed rabbit every single day. Jonathan immediately thought of the small stuffed rabbit sitting on the back seat of Emily's car, the one he had once jokingly called an unusual pregnancy craving. Emily had simply smiled and said it belonged to someone very special. Margaret continued. Emily never forced conversations. She simply sat beside Lily every Tuesday evening and read stories aloud. After 6 weeks, Lily finally spoke her first sentence. Jonathan quietly asked, "What did she say?" Margaret's eyes glistened. "She asked Emily if it was possible to borrow a mother until she was brave enough to live without one." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "Emily never told me." Because she promised Lily their time together would belong only to them until the little girl felt safe enough to share it. Margaret reached into the dresser drawer and carefully removed another folder. This one contained school progress reports, artwork, counseling notes, and photographs showing Emily attending school concerts, birthday celebrations, and parent appreciation breakfasts. Jonathan flipped through each page in stunned silence. Emily had become the steady adult in Lily's life long before anyone else noticed. Mrs. Harper eventually became Lily's legal guardian, Margaret explained. Emily has simply remained the constant source of encouragement that every child deserves. Jonathan looked back at the drawing labeled "My Forever Family." The man standing beside Emily looked surprisingly familiar. The artist had given him dark hair, a blue tie, and a warm smile that matched Jonathan almost perfectly. "She has never met me," Jonathan whispered. Margaret nodded slowly. "No, but Emily spoke about you constantly." Every week Lily asked when she could meet the kind man who made Emily laugh again. Emily always answered the same way. She said the right moment had not arrived. Jonathan held the drawing carefully between his hands, overwhelmed by the realization that somewhere nearby a little girl already believed he was part of her future. Then Margaret quietly added one final sentence that made everything even more unexpected. "Jonathan, tomorrow morning Lily believes she is finally going to meet her hero, but she has no idea that the greatest surprise waiting for her is not you. It is the decision you are about to make." Jonathan barely slept that night. He returned home just after midnight, quietly unlocked the front door, and found Emily asleep on the living room couch with one hand resting protectively over their unborn daughter. An open novel lay across her lap, untouched for hours. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow across the room, making everything feel painfully ordinary after everything he had learned. He stood there for several minutes, watching the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. How many evenings had she come home carrying invisible stories while pretending nothing extraordinary had happened? How many times had she smiled across the dinner table after spending hours comforting strangers, reading to a grieving child, or helping people who would never be able to repay her? Jonathan quietly lifted the blanket that had slipped from her shoulders and tucked it around her. Emily stirred slightly, but did not wake. She whispered his name in her sleep, smiled faintly, and rested her hand against the place where he had been standing only seconds before. Jonathan felt his eyes burn. She still trusted him completely, while he had spent the evening questioning the very foundation of their marriage. Before sunrise, he walked into his home office instead of preparing for another day of meetings. His calendar was filled from morning until evening with investment presentations, conference calls, and negotiations worth millions of dollars. For the first time in years, none of it seemed important. He canceled every appointment with a single email. His assistant immediately called, worried something serious had happened. Jonathan answered honestly. Something important has happened. I finally realized I have been investing in everything except the people who matter most. After hanging up, he opened another document. This time it was not a financial report. It was the foundation proposal he had drafted months earlier, but never finished because business always seemed more urgent. The organization had originally been designed to provide scholarships for students interested in entrepreneurship. Jonathan quietly deleted the title and began writing a completely different mission. Community libraries, foster youth, caregivers, senior assistants, family support, reading programs. The words flowed faster than he could type. Every page reflected another piece of Emily's quiet world. By the time the sun rose, the proposal no longer resembled his original vision. It resembled hers. At breakfast, Emily noticed his unusual silence. She poured orange juice into 2 glasses and smiled gently across the kitchen island. You look tired, she said. Jonathan forced a small smile. Long night. She nodded sympathetically without asking more questions. That was Emily. She never demanded explanations before someone was ready to give them. Jonathan realized she had offered him that same grace throughout their entire marriage. As Emily prepared to leave for another prenatal appointment, Jonathan quietly picked up his car keys. Would you mind if I came with you today? Emily looked surprised, but genuinely happy. I would love that. During the drive, she rested one hand over his, and neither of them spoke much. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt precious. Halfway there, Emily suddenly glanced toward the passenger seat. I almost forgot, she said with a laugh. There is someone I promised we would visit after my appointment, if you are not too busy. Jonathan smiled softly, already knowing exactly who she meant. I am not busy today. Emily looked relieved. Good. There is a little girl who has been asking about you for months. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. Then I think it is finally time we met. Emily laughed, completely unaware that every hidden chapter of her life had already transformed the man sitting beside her. As the city skyline slowly disappeared behind them, and the familiar neighborhood came into view once again, Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and quietly touched the folded drawing Lily had made. He had already decided that before the day ended, one more promise would be made, and unlike every business contract he had ever signed, this one would not change a balance sheet. It would change a family forever. The children's clinic occupied the first floor of the same community center where Emily had quietly spent so many evenings over the past 3 years. Bright murals covered the hallway walls, transforming ordinary rooms into forests, oceans, and star-filled skies. Jonathan watched children carrying books almost as large as themselves, while volunteers greeted each family by name. Emily belonged here in a way he had never witnessed before. Every nurse smiled when she walked in. Every volunteer waved. One elderly custodian gently touched his heart before thanking her for helping his grandson learn to read. Jonathan realized these people were not simply being polite. They genuinely loved her. After Emily finished her prenatal appointment with reassuring news that both she and the baby were healthy, she led Jonathan upstairs toward a colorful reading room. She paused outside the door, suddenly looking more nervous than he had ever seen her. I have been imagining this moment for months, she admitted with a quiet laugh. I just hope she likes you as much in person as she already does in her imagination. Jonathan smiled warmly. I have a feeling I am the one hoping to be liked. Emily gently pushed open the door. Inside, Lily sat cross-legged on a bright blue rug, carefully arranging picture books into neat little stacks. Mrs. Harper rested nearby in a comfortable chair, looking stronger than Jonathan expected. Margaret stood beside the window, offering Jonathan the smallest knowing smile before quietly stepping back. Lily looked up as the door opened. Her eyes immediately found Emily. "You came," she shouted happily before running across the room and wrapping her arms around Emily's waist as carefully as a child could around someone expecting a baby. Emily laughed softly and hugged her back. "I told you I would." Lily then noticed Jonathan standing a few feet away. She became completely still. For several long seconds, she simply studied his face, comparing the real man to the version she had apparently imagined through Emily's stories. Finally, she smiled. "You look exactly how she said you would." Jonathan blinked in surprise. "Is that a good thing?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "She said your eyes always smile before your mouth does." Jonathan laughed quietly, realizing Emily had been describing him to Lily with the same affection she used when speaking directly to him. Lily slowly walked closer until she stood directly in front of him. Then she reached into the pocket of her sweater and carefully unfolded the drawing Jonathan had carried in his jacket all morning. "I made another one," she whispered. Jonathan accepted the picture with both hands. This time there were 4 people standing beneath the same bright blue roof. Emily, Jonathan, a little girl, and a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Above them, written in careful letters, were the words, "Families can grow more than one way." Jonathan felt emotion catch unexpectedly in his throat. He knelt until he was at Lily's eye level. "May I ask you something?" Lily nodded. "Would it be all right if I became part of your story too?" Lily looked toward Emily first, seeking silent permission. Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears, but she simply smiled and nodded once. Without saying another word, Lily stepped forward and hugged Jonathan with complete trust. The room fell beautifully quiet. Mrs. Harper wiped away tears. Margaret quietly closed her eyes. Emily covered her mouth, overwhelmed by a moment she had secretly hoped for but never dared to expect. Jonathan looked at Emily over Lily's shoulder and finally understood the greatest lesson his wife had been trying to live every day. Families were not built only by birth certificates or shared last names. Sometimes they were built one promise, one quiet kindness, and one open heart at a time. As Lily released the hug, Jonathan reached into his briefcase and removed the folder he had rewritten before sunrise. He placed it gently into Emily's hands. She glanced at the first page, then looked back at him in complete disbelief as she read the new title across the top. The Emily Brooks Community Foundation. 1 year later, the front doors of the Emily Brooks Community Foundation opened beneath a bright spring sky, and the line stretching around the block had nothing to do with ribbon cuttings or television cameras. Families carrying children's backpacks stood beside senior citizens with walkers. Foster parents chatted with college volunteers. Teachers, librarians, nurses, veterans, and small business owners gathered in the same place because one woman's quiet compassion had inspired an entire community to believe that kindness could become something larger than a single act. Jonathan stood near the entrance holding the hand of his daughter, Grace Hayes, whose tiny fingers wrapped tightly around his own. Across the courtyard, Emily laughed as Lily helped push Grace's stroller beneath colorful balloons tied to the garden fence. Watching the 3 of them together, Jonathan realized that the happiest moments in his life no longer happened inside boardrooms or at shareholder meetings. They happened in ordinary places filled with extraordinary people. Mrs. Harper had regained enough strength to volunteer at the reading room twice a week, greeting every child with the same patient smile that had once changed Emily's life. Margaret now directed the foundation's literacy program, proudly watching shelves overflow with books donated by families from every neighborhood in the city. The reading room had become so popular that another location was already under construction across town. Reporters occasionally asked Jonathan why he had shifted so much of his time and fortune toward community programs instead of expanding his business empire. He always gave the same answer: "Because the greatest investment I have ever made was not measured in dollars. It was measured in people who finally believed they mattered." He never mentioned that none of the vision had truly been his. It had always belonged to Emily. She simply lived it long before anyone else noticed. Later that afternoon, after the visitors had gone home and the building had grown quiet again, Jonathan and Emily sat together on a wooden bench beneath an old maple tree behind the foundation. Grace slept peacefully in her stroller while Lily read aloud to Mrs. Harper from a novel they had borrowed from the library. The familiar sound made Emily smile. Jonathan reached into his wallet and carefully removed a folded piece of paper that had become worn from being opened so many times. Emily recognized it immediately. It was Lily's drawing of the four of them standing beneath the blue roof, with the words "families can grow more than one way" written across the top. "You still carry it?" Emily asked softly. Jonathan nodded. "Every single day." She gently rested her head against his shoulder. "Why?" Jonathan looked across the garden where children laughed among flower beds planted by volunteers from the neighborhood Emily had quietly visited for years. "Because whenever I think success is about numbers again, I look at this drawing and remember how wrong I once was." Emily smiled without saying anything else. She understood. She always had. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the garden, Jonathan thought back to the evening he had decided to follow his wife, convinced he was about to discover betrayal hidden in the darkness. Instead, he had discovered compassion hidden in plain sight. He had gone searching for a secret and found a purpose. He had followed fear and arrived at love. Sometimes life changes because of a single decision. Sometimes it changes because someone quietly chooses kindness every day without expecting applause. Jonathan finally understood that wealth could build beautiful houses, impressive companies, and comfortable lives, but only generosity could build a home inside another person's heart. And in the end, the greatest secret Emily had ever kept was never about where she went each evening. It was that the richest person in their marriage had never been the millionaire at all.